structure people in growing communities deserve, and that will only come from an Albanese Labor government.
The time has concluded. I'm sorry for the member for Bennelong. There's only a few seconds left. It now being 2 o'clock, in accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to threats by the Attorney-General that state governments may again face High Court challenges to force their borders open. Can the Prime Minister confirm that he spent $1 million of taxpayers' money supporting Clive Palmer's attempt to tear down the Western Australian border last year, and that some of it went directly to Clive Palmer?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, we did not pursue that matter, and we are not pursuing those matters.
The member for Fisher has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Given that we know widespread lockdowns present a significant negative effect on our economy, will the Prime Minister outline to the House how sticking to the national plan ensures a way forward for our country to safely live with the virus, restore Australia's economic future and get businesses going again and Australians into jobs?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Fisher for his question. Can I especially thank him for his untiring advocacy on the issue of mental health in this parliament, and particularly for our young people. He has been an extraordinary advocate and informed the government's policy significantly, including the more than $2 billion that we announced in last year's budget. And I commend the member for Fisher for his extraordinary work and passion. Mr Speaker, he also knows that the national plan will enable Australians to live safely with the virus into the future. That's what it achieves. That's why it's important to move away from the heavy burden of these terrible lockdowns that are being lived with in 2 states and 1 territory, even now as we speak, and also to not have to live with the threat of such heavy lockdowns hanging over the rest of the country, Mr Speaker. The national plan is essential, critical to Australia's economic recovery. And today, Mr Speaker, the national accounts that have been released affirms that despite the tremendous challenges of COVID over the course of 2020-2021, our economic response as a government, investing in the resilience of the Australian economy and the businesses and the households, Mr Speaker, has proven to be highly effective. And that has ensured, Mr Speaker, that Australians have been able to continue to make their way through. Now it's certainly difficult, there's no doubt about that, Mr Speaker. But what the national accounts reveal is an economy that is resilient, an economy that has been supported by the targeted and well thought through economic interventions, Mr Speaker, that is seeing Australia through. Supporting incomes, keeping our economy ticking over, enabling Australians to build their first home, supporting new investment of businesses all around the country to drive our economy through at a very difficult time. Mr Speaker, all measures working closely together to achieve what has been, over the course of 2020-2021, an extraordinary economic comeback. An economic comeback that some doubted would occur, Mr Speaker, but now puts Australia on the course of the last financial year as one of the most successful developed economies in the world in countering the impact of COVID-19. But the challenges are still there, and we are now going to face the same challenge again. As the Delta strain has wreaked its havoc on countries all around the world, and including here in Australia, we will mount that comeback again, Mr Speaker, and the same economic policies and determination and commitment that has seen Australia once through this pandemic economically, putting 1 million people back into work, Mr Speaker, we will do it again, Mr Speaker. And Australians can have confidence that we will produce, through our policies, the confidence that they can go ahead, Mr Speaker, to support an economy that guarantees the essentials that Australians rely on.
Has concluded, and I call the member for Whitlam.
Thanks, Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. The Treasurer said our economy was ahead of the pack, but new numbers show it's growing more slowly than the US, the UK and the OECD average. And the current quarter has been extremely tough for Australians. Was your claim ahead of the pack about as accurate as your claim to be back in black?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Australian people watching today's question time could be mistaken for thinking the honourable member actually wanted the economy to contract in the June quarter, Mr Speaker. They were actually begging and hoping and wishing that our economy would contract. Well, the reality is it didn't. The reality is it didn't. The reality is that at 0.7% in the June quarter, we saw economic growth that was better than what the market was expecting, Mr Speaker. And that we now see our economy at 1.6% bigger than it was going into the pre-pandemic levels. Now, the honourable member references other countries. Well, let me tell him that in France, their economy has contracted by 3.2%, whereas ours is up by 1.6%. In Germany, their economy is contracted by 3.3%, where our economy is up by 1.6%. And in the United Kingdom, their economy is contracted by 4.4%, and our economy is up by 1.6%. Now, Mr Speaker, these are the June quarter numbers. And of course, we're going to have a tough September quarter with our two major states in lockdown. But I'd say to the honourable member, what these numbers show today is that our economic plan has helped drive economic growth. And I point to the dwelling investment numbers, up by more than 15% through the year. A pipeline of 151,000 house approvals over the course of the last year, driven by programs like Home Builder that those opposite did not support, Mr Speaker. And our immediate expensing provisions that have seen machinery and equipment up since the last October's budget by more than 22%, Mr Speaker. Normally, in a recession, you get businesses that put their wallets back in their pocket and don't invest in economic growth. But these businesses across Australia are buying a new harvester for the farm, they're buying a new cafe machine for the coffee shop, they're buying new tools and equipment for the tradie, and they're investing in their future because they have hope and they have confidence about Australia's future. So today's economic numbers show that we had seen solid growth over the June quarter, that our economy is strong, our economy is resilient, and our economy will bounce back strongly once restrictions start to ease.
And I call the member for Dawson.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how regional Australia has been front and centre, delivering 0.7% growth in today's national accounts figures, confirming the success of the Morrison-Joyce government navigating Australia safely through the pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'd like to thank the unassuming and quiet and retiring member for Dawson for that question. The member for Dawson, who was instrumental in the Mackay Ring Road Stage 2, and the one thing we're not looking forward to is another one of his, whatever that TikTok or whatever he put on Facebook. He has been absolutely incredible for Urana Dam, and I look forward to working as hard as I can, as quick as I can, to get that dam built. Mr Speaker, the national accounts, agriculture, highest ever gross value at $48.3 billion, up from $48.1. Agriculture, Mr Speaker, contributed more than a third of last year's GDP growth. Now, Prime Minister, isn't it a difference that you make in the short time I've been back in the agricultural portfolio?
Just this week.
Mr Speaker, it has been an incredible thing to go to sale yards. Once, I remember, Mr Speaker, if you got $1.20, you're doing well. I was speaking to Scotty Simshauser, and she's probably watching out there from Tamworth. I said, Scotty, what's the price today? $5 a kilogram live. $5 a kilogram live. I said, hey, Scotty, how about we buy some fat lambs? What's that going to set me back? He went, mate, you're well over $200. I can remember
Members
the
on my
time,
left.
Mr Speaker, that if you got $40 for a fat lamb, you're doing well. Mr Speaker, agriculture under this government has been a roaring success because it shows a plan. It makes sure that we work hard, and I'd like to commend the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, instant asset write-off. It was brilliant. Whether at McDonald's Transport, Prime Mover, instant asset write-off. You're buying a cattle crush from Guyra, buy it, up to your yards, instant asset write-off. You're buying panels.
Member for Griffith is warned.
If you are doing the things that make your productivity greater, you could get the support from a coalition government, and the coalition government has taken this section of the economy roaring ahead, and we believe in irrigation. We believe in irrigation, Mr Speaker. We're building dams. Dry acre at St George probably produces you about, I don't know, $60 worth of wool. A green acre, irrigated acre, $9,000 worth of cotton. We know the numbers. We know how to make this economy bigger. We know how to create the economy that can pay for the great stimulus work that this government has done to keep Australians going forward, to keep our net growth going forward, to keep our nation safe, to give the Australians the hope and the safety of a plan that will take them to a better future.
And I call the member for Oxley.
My question is to the Minister for Regional Development. I refer to the announcement made by the Minister for Regional Development of $8 million for the Fitzroy Community Hospice. Why did the Minister allow Senator Pauline Hanson to gazump himself and the member for Capricornia and announce the grant the day before?
The Minister for Regional Development and Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I'd like to note that, of course, we have Labor Party members who lobby us for grants, especially in regional areas, because we love regional areas. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I can give you the letters. It goes very well. It goes very well. And of course, we have senators who lobby us. But I can tell you one thing. Mr Speaker. It's the member for Capricornia who, because of COVID, can't be here today. It's the member for Flynn sitting up there. That's the reason we got Rookwood Weir. I've seen the member for Flynn's seat, member for Capricornia. Look for it. And I can tell you it's the member for Capricornia with the Keppel Bay Sailing Club, $20 million. She was instrumental in that. And I can tell you, Mr Speaker, it's a Rocky Sports Stadium. I look forward to continuing on to be the Rocky Sports Stadium.
Just resume his seat for a second. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, goes to relevance. The question goes to why it is that Senator Hanson is making government announcements prior to the minister.
Will resume his seat. I listened carefully to the Deputy Prime Minister at the beginning of his answer, and I appreciate it. He mightn't have answered it in the way the Leader of the Opposition wishes, but I do think he was relevant to the question, and he's now giving some context. So keep listening.
And context, I'm happy to give. Because although I note that Senator Hanson has lobbied it, I can tell you right now that the member for Capricornia with the Rocky Hospital car park at $7 million, or the Rocky Sports Stadium for $23 million, or Rookwood Weir, $183 million, the Rocky Ring Road, Beef Australia.
I do think the Deputy Prime Minister's now sort of straying from...
I accept your
from the one example that was given in the question to a whole lot that weren't asked about.
Mr Speaker, and would say that quite obviously it is the case that if we have an announcement, then a whole range of people, like, you know what they say, we say about success and failure and the parentage of both, but it's we can tell you that success is driven by government. Announcements are driven by government. The government has the Expenditure Review Committee. Government has the Expenditure Review Committee that approves the money. The government has the Cabinet that approves the policy. And this government, on this side, has a member for Capricornia, Michelle Landry, who's been an absolutely tireless worker for her electorate. Just as the member for Flynn has, just as the member for Hinkler has, just as the member for Clare has, just as the member for Riverina has. It has been a great team that has brought so much to regional Australia, and I look forward to working with the member for Capricornia for so many other further announcements, because the people of Central Queensland realise that when they had the other side of government in, they were forgotten about. They were taken for granted.
Members on my left.
They were taken for granted. And what the final insult was for the people of Central Queensland, where this piece of infrastructure is is the Leader of the Opposition went up there, but he didn't want to take the media to Warrenbar. We all remember that.
No,
there we go.
You're
like
well
a
and
gnome
truly
in the
straying
grass.
now, Deputy
The
Prime Minister.
The only thing you can know, the only thing you find him is if the lawnmower accidentally hit him. So, Mr. Speaker, the member for Capricornia, I know, is making sure that she will continue to frequent my office, lobbying for things, as no
Deputy
doubt
Prime
other
Minister's
senators
time
will,
has
as no doubt
concluded.
members.
Member for Griffith, I'm being very tolerant. I have been very tolerant. It's now ended. I realise there aren't a lot of people here, but I'll still use 94A. And I call the Leader of the Greens.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Your job is to keep all people safe, not just some. But even though you've set an 80% vaccination target for adults, there's no target for children, nor for at-risk communities like First Nations peoples or people with disabilities. Everywhere from Wilcannia to the United States, we're seeing the virus rip through at-risk communities. Prime Minister, at National Cabinet this Friday, will you ensure the National Plan has separate vaccination targets for children, First Nations people, people with disabilities and other at-risk groups, so that they're vaccinated to at least the same levels as the broader population when restrictions are eased?
The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and highlighting those very important groups within our community, all of which are encompassed within the National Plan. And the member may not be familiar with the details of the National Plan, Mr. Speaker, and in particular how it recognises that even within the overall vaccination targets of 70 and 80%, that there is a strong recognition in all the work that has been done going into that plan that there will need to be careful management around vulnerable communities. Those vulnerable communities are coal communities, they're Indigenous communities. There are a range of many other communities, Mr. Speaker, where vaccination levels, for a range of reasons, those who are homeless, Mr. Speaker, those who are have issues with substance abuse, Mr. Speaker. There are a range of varying groups across the community which will require continued careful management for their public health. Now, the Chief Minister here in the ACT has been making this point extremely well, and he and I have discussed it on numerous occasions as we've been preparing plans to deal with a pandemic that post-70 and 80% vaccinations will require an ongoing and very careful public health plan that deals with disadvantaged communities, socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. We've seen this in how the pandemic has played out, not just here in Australia, but all around the world. And there will be a very clear and cooperative national strategy that deals with the ongoing public health needs of disadvantaged communities. But that plan will ensure that the broader community will also be able to go forward. And this is why it's a safe plan. It's a safe plan that enables the broad spectrum of Australia to move ahead and to avoid these terrible lockdowns that are causing so much pain, and for Australians to move on from that and not live in fear of them either, but at the same time ensure that we have very targeted and focused public health responses at a state and at a federal level that understands the very serious needs of those communities, be they in remote places. This is a matter the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory has consistently raised, and we have worked together on from the outset, Mr. Speaker, working closely with him, as we indeed are now, because there is such a disparate, Mr. Speaker, performance on vaccinations, particularly in the Northern Territory.
Will cease interjecting.
And so that is exactly what the National Plan provides for. I'm sure the member will be pleased to hear that. And if you'd like to learn more about it, Mr. Speaker, then we'd be very happy to ensure he could be provided with further details if he was so interested.
And I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House yet again of the Morrison government's very strong record of ensuring our economy remains resilient in the face of the many challenges brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question and acknowledge there are more than 10,000 businesses in the honourable member's electorate who are going to benefit from the immediate expensing provisions that are now available to them as a result of policies that we've supported on this side of the House. And I had the welcome opportunity to join the member for Robertson in her electorate before these lockdowns, and I had an opportunity to meet with a young female apprentice, a young female electrician apprentice, and to hear how the government's wage subsidy is supporting her opportunities to get into training and to get a job. Now, Mr Speaker, today we had the national account numbers, and they showed that the Australian economy is strong. They show that the Australian economy continues to grow. They show that the fundamentals of the Australian economy remain sound and that the Australian economy remains resilient in the face of the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. Now, Mr Speaker, in the June quarter, 29 days saw lockdowns in one part of the country or another, including across our 4 largest states. Yet our economy still grew by 0.7% ahead of market expectations. And we have seen through the year growth of 9.6%, Mr Speaker, strong through the year growth across our economy. Now, this growth was driven by an improvement in household consumption, up 1.1%, more than 15% through the year. And our tax relief that we've provided to Australian households saw nearly $4 million in the June quarter go into households' pockets. And we also saw dwelling investment off the back of programs like Home Builder, up again more than 15% through the year with a strong pipeline of construction. We saw business investment, particularly machinery and equipment, being very strong, with machinery and equipment up by more than 22% since last year's October budget. That's the fastest growth in machinery and equipment expenditure in nearly 20 years, Mr Speaker, in nearly 20 years off the back of our immediate expensing provisions. And as the Deputy Prime Minister has said, farm GDP has been extremely strong, up by more than 40% compared to over through the year, Mr Speaker, as a result of a bumper winter harvest. So whether it's household consumption, whether it's dwelling investment, whether it's business investment, or whether it's farm GDP, or even public sector final demand, which is government infrastructure across the states and territories, it's helping to create more and more jobs. So we can be hopeful, we can be confident, we can be optimistic about our future because the Australian economy and its fundamentals remain strong.
The member for Griffith.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why didn't the government put rules in place to require JobKeeper payments to profitable companies with rising revenue to be returned to the taxpayer? The government makes welfare recipients and parents who receive the childcare subsidy return excess payments. Why weren't the same rules put in place for profitable companies with rising revenue?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, when we announced JobKeeper, at one of the most difficult times this country has seen in decades, the country was looking into the economic abyss like so many countries around the world. People didn't know whether they would be able to go to work the next day, or indeed if they'd ever see work again. Mr Speaker, the number of people who, that very day we announced it, were intending to have had given to them notices that they would not be coming back to work, I've heard the stories from all around the country. And when we announced it, it had many purposes. Of course, to provide that income support that was necessary on a scale Australia has never had to engage in before, and to effectively marshal the private sector payrolls of this country to deliver a level of social security and income support we had never seen before. And it was a great partnership between the government, between private sector employees and indeed Australia's financial institutions and the banks, to enable that level of economic support to provide an injection of confidence that was so desperately needed. And we made a deal, Mr Speaker, with the employers of this country. We said we are going to provide this support for companies going into this situation, and it will be there for 6 months. That's what we put in this place. We made that promise, and Labor voted for it. Labor voted for it, Mr Speaker. We said we were going to stand by this economy and those businesses, and we made that legal. We did that together. And, Mr Speaker, what I hear from those opposite now is they want to change the rules afterwards. They want to change the goalposts. They want to shift the mark, Mr Speaker. They want to have it each way, Mr Speaker. They want to support JobKeeper and they want to oppose JobKeeper. This is a constant theme of the Leader of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. This is a constant theme. We made that commitment.
Will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Speaker. On direct relevance, the question does not go to the whole of the JobKeeper program. The question... So I've got the call for the moment. The question does not go to the whole of the JobKeeper program. The question goes simply to those employers, those companies that ended up with rising revenue and turned a profit.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm going to hear from the Leader of the House and then I'm ready to rule, but I don't want to keep cutting the Leader of the House off.
No, well, Mr Speaker, at some stage I probably should put a question to you about this continual conduct, which you've commented on and I think chastised both the Leader of the Opposition and the Manager of Opposition Business on a number of occasions, because it is an abuse of the standing orders, and they repeat getting up and making a statement which goes beyond the standing order, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the House. Sorry? Okay, well, look, I will rule on whether points of order are frivolous or not. I've heard from the Manager of Opposition Business. The question was very specific, but the way it was framed was, why didn't the government take certain action? And I think the Prime Minister's been very relevant up until now. I'd have to say the answer has nothing to do with his observations about the Leader of the Opposition, because he didn't ask the question. But certainly in explaining how the program evolved and how it passed through the parliament, I mean, that is being relevant to the question, even if he's not answering in the way you'd prefer, the Prime Minister.
Speaker, the question put by the Labor member, betrays what we have seen from the Labor Party in this place. It betrays, Mr Speaker, because what was essential at that time was that what was committed to was followed through, Mr Speaker. And that is what gave the Australian business community the confidence to keep people on the payroll, to then put 1 million people back into work, and to ensure that, Mr Speaker, under the national accounts, as we have just seen, that Australia's economy is now bigger at the end of June than it was before we went into the pandemic. What we have seen, Mr Speaker, in the questions put by the Labor Party is they will happily change the rules on business, Mr Speaker. They will happily flip it, and they cannot be trusted. They cannot be trusted on anything they say when it comes to the economy, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I'm calling the member for Wentworth. Member for Wentworth has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please inform the House of the significance of today's 70th anniversary of Australia's most important strategic and military partnership, the US alliance?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, a man who has served his country as an ambassador and continues to do great work as a local member of parliament and one of the strongest supporters of our relationship with the United States. Mr Speaker, as we know, 70 years ago today in San Francisco, the compact was signed between Australia, the United States and New Zealand. Of course, came off the back of the Second World War, and it came off the back of an effort of our allied troops to save the world from a particular course and a direction that would have been harmful, devastating to the entire world for many decades. The world would never have recovered from the Second World War had the United States and the Allies not approached Germany and the forces against us during that period without the resolute capacity that only the United States can bring to a wartime effort. And since that time, Mr Speaker, over the 7 decades, we have stood with the United States has stood with us. We've seen in its most recent iteration in the Middle East, we bought out 4,100 Australian citizens, visa holders, permanent residents. Not one of those people, Mr Speaker, would have made it to our plane if it wasn't for the effort of the United States. And it wasn't just us, Mr Speaker. New Zealand, France, Spain, rattle off the countries. They were not able to have a presence at Kabul without those 4,000 soldiers there and without the 1,000 British soldiers there, an incredible partnership for us with the United Kingdom as well. Our countries would not have achieved the success without the United States. And so we turn our attention now, Mr Speaker, to the Indo-Pacific region, and we know that there is greater uncertainty in this region than at any time since the Second World War. And it is more important than ever for countries in our region to see the rock that is the relationship between the United States, our country, and New Zealand. Our shared values, our perspective on the world, our belief in freedom of speech, our belief in a sovereign right, our belief in making sure that democratic processes prevail has been at the core of the peacetime success that has resulted in millions of people being lifted from poverty and put on a much more certain trajectory than otherwise they would have faced. And with uncertainty in our region now, Mr Speaker, the Australian public knows that our ANZUS alliance is more important now than it even was 70 years ago. And for all of those leaders on both sides of the equation who have given their commitment to this compact for 70 years should know that this government will continue to reinforce the ANZUS Treaty for many, many decades to come.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I join with the Defence Minister and others who spoke earlier today as well in commemorating and indeed celebrating the 70 years of the ANZUS Treaty. It is our most important relationship. It will be even more important going forward given the uncertain times that we're in, and I certainly commend my further comments and indeed the comments of both sides of the House in the earlier debate on what is a bipartisan commitment between Australia and the United States based upon friendship.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Rachel in my electorate is 24 weeks pregnant. She cannot get an appointment for the vaccine recommended for her until November 2. She's on the wait list at 5 GP clinics and was turned away when she tried to get a vaccination at a walk-in clinic. In Newcastle, another pregnant woman, just like Rachel, is in intensive care with COVID. How could the Prime Minister leave pregnant women so vulnerable?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And whilst I don't have Rachel's details, I'd be very happy to receive them and to see if we could assist in some way, shape or form. We are aware of the other case to which the member refers, and we are seeking details from New South Wales Health at this stage. I've not received them, but I have requested them. In terms of vaccination for women who are pregnant, on the 9th of June 2021, the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, ATAGI as it's well known, in conjunction with the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, or RANZCOG, issued a joint statement recommending that pregnant women are routinely offered Pfizer mRNA vaccine at any stage of pregnancy. From a Commonwealth perspective, they have been prioritised through that period, and we have been encouraging general practices. We've been Commonwealth vaccination clinics and as well as state clinics in order to provide that support. I know within the Hunter region there are over, more broadly, there are over 8,500 primary care vaccination sites across the country, and approximately 200 are in the Hunter region, as the member would be aware, and this includes 110 general practices, 2 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled health services, and over 70 community pharmacies. In particular, 50 of those general practices have had early access to Pfizer in the Hunter region, and we would be happy to assist in either of those cases. We continue to encourage all practices to provide priority to pregnant women in line with the advice of ATAGI as issued on the 9th of June.
And I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's unprecedented financial support and its decisive economic management is keeping our economy resilient as we move towards a national plan to return to life after the COVID-19 pandemic? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and acknowledge her strong support for the policies of the Morrison government, which are designed to help create jobs and help Australia get through the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. And last year, at the height of the pandemic, we were staring into the economic abyss. Treasury thought that the unemployment rate could reach as high as 15%. That's more than 2 million Australians potentially unemployed. And that economic growth could contract in the June quarter by more than 20%. That's nearly the size of the Victorian economy. That's what Australia faced at the height of this pandemic. And we responded with overwhelming and unprecedented amounts of economic support. Direct economic and health support now totalling more than $300 billion. And that economic support has seen a strong rebound across the economy. At the back half of last year, we saw the strongest growth numbers in more than 50 years. We've seen our unemployment rate come down to 4.6%, the lowest in 12 years. I point out to the House that when we came to government, the unemployment rate was 5.7%, Mr Speaker. And I point out that today, as of the end of the June quarter, our employment levels are 1.5% higher than they were going into the pandemic. And in Canada, they're 1.5% below. And in the United States, they're 4.5% below. So, Mr Speaker, we have put in place policies that have helped support the economy. Now, one of those policies is JobKeeper. And JobKeeper supported 3.8 million Australians and around 1 million Australian businesses. It's a program that was described by the Governor of the Reserve Bank as a remarkable program. And the Australian National Audit Office said the ATO in administering the program was highly effective in their management of risks. And we also know from a Treasury review that, in their words, the Federal Treasury, they said that the program was well targeted. Now, Mr Speaker, am I aware of alternative approaches? I am from those opposite who seek to diminish from what has been the most remarkable economic support program this country has ever seen, and a program that has helped support millions of our fellow Australians. And now the Labor Party is seeking to destroy a fundamental tenet, a fundamental position in our tax system, and to force the Tax Commissioner to dump data before the Senate. Now, Mr Speaker, that is a dangerous precedent, and that is one that has been called out by business groups. Our programs throughout this crisis, including right now with the COVID disaster payment and the business support payments, are designed to keep Australians in jobs.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Prime Minister said, ultimately, everything is a state matter. Was it the states or was it the Prime Minister who failed to deliver enough vaccine supply?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I was being asked about state borders when that matter was raised yesterday, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left.
That is a public health social measure. A border closure is done on the basis of a public health order. Mr Speaker, it's done on the basis of public health orders. That's exactly what it is. The Leader of the Opposition might want to freshen up on some of the facts, Mr Speaker. He might want to get across some of these issues if he wants to engage in these snide interjections, Mr Speaker, that are a result, Mr Speaker, of his own lack of knowledge and understanding of the challenges this country faces. Mr Speaker, what I do know is this. Today, Mr Speaker, I read that this is a very wise statement made by a member of the Senate, Mr Speaker. I think we are getting to the end of the lockdown era, partly because we are doing so well on vaccinations.
Mr Speaker, Senator Kitching, the Labor senator from New South Wales, Mr Speaker, has had an outbreak of truth in the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. There's been an outbreak of truth, Mr Speaker. But I think the Leader of the Opposition remains vaccinated against the truth, Mr Speaker. Means completely vaccinated. There's no shortage of that, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the Leader of the Opposition. Today, Mr Speaker, what we do know today is, Mr Speaker, again, more than 330,000 vaccines and doses administered right around the country again. Today, Mr Speaker, we will go close. Indeed, I expect we will breach the 20 million doses that have been administered around the country. This week, Mr Speaker, we announced the 500,000 of additional doses of hope coming for Pfizer, Mr Speaker, through the arrangement we were able to put together with the government of Singapore. The 1 million doses and more that we're able to secure in our arrangement with the Polish government, Mr Speaker, working these issues, ensuring we leave no stone unturned to ensure that we can continue to accelerate the vaccination program that is now achieving rates of weekly vaccination, Mr Speaker, that exceed those even of the United States and the United Kingdom at their peak. Now, those opposite, they may want to talk this down. I'm pleased Senator Kitching has decided to take a different approach. They may want to seek to undermine and be negative, Mr Speaker, and hope for the worst, but the government will continue working to deliver for the best of this country, Mr Speaker. And we're not only seeing that with the vaccination program, we're seeing it with the economic supports, Mr Speaker, that has enabled us to bring Australians through one of the biggest crises this country has ever seen, Mr Speaker. So we will continue to do that, Mr Speaker, while the opposition will continue to be negative.
The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. Is the Leader of the Opposition can't be seeking the call for a question. He's seeking it.
I'm asking the Prime Minister to withdraw the comment that he just made. He's made it repeatedly. I've now lost 7 of my constituents have died. No one in Australia is hoping for the worst from this disease, because that's the worst, a loss of life. And I'd ask the Prime Minister
the Leader of the Opposition's made his point. The remark was not unparliamentary. There's no doubt about that. The Leader of the Opposition can make the request, which he's done, but it's a matter for the Prime Minister, given it wasn't an unparliamentary remark. The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on how Australia's vaccine rollout and national plan will assist small businesses and employees to return to work?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins for her question and her work as a national leading paediatrician prior to coming to this place. We know that in the last 24 hours, over 560,000 cases have been diagnosed as part of the global pandemic, and 8,500 people have lost their lives. These numbers continue every day at agonising global levels. Australia has been spared so much of it, but we have not been spared absolutely, as we see so clearly in New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT at the moment. But one of the things which is fundamental is what's occurring at the moment with vaccinations. We see, as the Prime Minister has said, over 334,000 vaccinations in the last 24 hours alone, the highest rate for a Tuesday, which always leads to a very good outcome for the rest of the week. We're now at 19.7 million, and as the PM says, expected to pass over 20 million doses today that have been delivered. And very significantly, that's 1.95 million, almost 2 million Australians in 1 week. Almost 2 million Australians in 1 week, or almost 10% of the eligible population, have come forward for either a first or a second dose, a rate which is higher than anything achieved by either the United States or the UK at the peak of their rollouts. And to do that, we're drawing upon the entire national network, our GPs, our pharmacies, our Commonwealth vaccination clinics. In particular, I want to thank and acknowledge our Aboriginal medical services and our state vaccine clinics. Very importantly, as we do this, we see that we have we are on the cusp of achieving 60% first dose coverage for the entire nation. That should occur probably during question time today. 60% first dose rates for the entire nation, and in the coming 48 hours we are likely to pass 80% of everybody over the age of 50. That 80% mark for everybody over the age of 50. And for the country as a whole, what matters about that 60% first dose rate means that we are now approximately 2.2 million Australians from the 70% level. We are now approximately 4.2 million Australians from the 80% level. So these numbers are not that far away. And at the pace of almost 2 million vaccinations a week, you can see how close. You can see that it's there. You can see that we're on the cusp of achieving the levels which will allow the national plan to be delivered to help create jobs and save jobs. And I welcome the comments of both the New South Wales and Victorian Premiers recommitting to that plan to save jobs and save lives.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday the Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Was it the states or was it the PM who failed to vaccinate aged care workers? Is it any wonder the New South Wales Premier is aghast at this performance, saying today, quote, "There was a process where aged care workers would get vaccinated first. We had tens of thousands of them in New South Wales who hadn't been offered the vaccine. We're playing catch-up now." Isn't Premier Berejiklian right?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the Minister for Health and Aged Care may wish to add to that answer. The vaccination rate for aged care workers now is 78.8% on first dose, Mr Speaker, and 56.7% on second dose. Importantly, for aged care residents, Mr Speaker, the first dose vaccination is 89%, and the second dose vaccination rate is 84.4%, Mr Speaker, and we know that that is the principal reason why we have seen in the course of the outbreak in New South Wales there's such significant fall in fatality rates compared to what we saw with a similar number of cases in Victoria in the outbreak last year. And, Mr Speaker, that has been an extraordinary effort by many, including the vaccination program led by General Frewen, Mr Speaker, and by Professor Murphy prior to that. And in addition to that, Mr Speaker, the great work being done by the New South Wales Government in partnership with the federal government. So, Mr Speaker, I thank them for that. We've been continuing to work on what is a very difficult program in that sector, but we do know the decision taken by our government to ensure that we focus first and absolutely on getting to every single residential aged care facility in this country and being able to offer two-dose vaccination has saved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lives, Mr Speaker. And that is ultimately the outcome that this is all about. Saving lives, saving livelihoods, Mr Speaker. That's what our program has been doing. More than 30,000 lives have been saved in this country because of the responses that the government, together with our partners around the country, have been putting in place now these many months, more than 18 months. And not only just the 30,000 and more lives that have been saved, Mr Speaker, but the million jobs, the million Australians who are back in jobs and can look forward to a future with confidence, Mr Speaker, because they've been living in a country whose COVID response has done both of those things. Saving lives and saving livelihoods. And, Mr Speaker, I need to add to it an earlier answer. I referred to Senator Kitching as being a senator from New South Wales. She's indeed, as we all know, a senator from Victoria, Mr Speaker, and that's the truth, just like she said.
No, the Prime Minister...
I was just adding, Mr Speaker, but the Minister for Health.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And to add to the Prime Minister's answer, 225,000 aged care workers have now had vaccinations, and what we've seen is that the pledge to put in place mandatory orders has had a major impact. We know that access has been available, but what we've seen over the last 6 weeks is 13,000, 11,000, 14,000, 13,000, 18,000, 7 weeks, 21,000 and 16,000 workers now take up the vaccination. I welcome the fact that last week New South Wales added a public health order to this. All of those elements have helped lift those rates. We do know that, unfortunately, it has been necessary to mandate. The access has been there, but the uptake is now there. We welcome it. It's saving lives and protecting lives.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Will the Minister please update the House on actions the Morrison-Joyce government is taking to protect regional, rural and remote Australians during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd first like to compliment the member for Mallee for her fierce campaigning and advocacy for her cross-border communities to make sure they don't get caught in the COVID crossfire and make sure they got the access to the medical services across the river or across the border that they deserve. Please be reassured that we are vaccinating in record levels around rural, regional and remote Australia. That is why, in the last week's figures, 493,000, almost 500,000 of those 1.9 million doses were delivered in that out of the metro regions in Australia. It's constantly being calibrated and recalibrated and adjusted so that we get more points of care, more points of vaccination, more point-of-care testing around regional Australia. In the member for Mallee's electorate, she'll be reassured. She's there on the ground. She probably knows this, but just to illustrate the point, there's 10 general practices in her hometown. There's 5 community pharmacies. There's 1 Aboriginal medical service and there's 1 Commonwealth vaccination centre. And the Royal Flying Doctor Service has brought forward their latest visit this week, not only into the Mallee, but up near the Queensland border, down on the coast, just yesterday and today at Wreck Bay. I would like to compliment Flying Doctor. They have turned up again, and I want to give a big shout out to one of their nurses, Kellyanne Johnson, who's Indigenous, is from the Jervis Bay area, and they were running a huge clinic in Wreck Bay. And the oldest recipient was an 88-year-old Indigenous lady, and the youngest was a 12-year-old boy. And one of the local leaders said Kellyanne is an inspiration, and now all the little kids say they want to be a flying doctor nurse too. So thank you, Kellyanne. But seriously, that lattice work of community-based primary care vaccination sites is why this ramp-up is working in regional Australia. If you look at the national figures, in the metro districts and outer metro, the vaccination rate last week at the finalisation figures was 58%. Just across the border, in rural and regional Australia, it was 57%. So we're matching the metro rollout. There are some waves where we're a bit behind, but we're catching up rapidly. And in the remote part of Australia, we have got extra support through the ADF and through the Oz medical assistance teams. Rural Australia not only generates the wealth of the country, it's also the playground of the city folk, and we are working to make sure regional, rural and remote Australia reaches the 70% and reaches the 80% at the same time, so we can all get going and get our life back. We have a plan that's being delivered.
The member for Werriwa has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday the Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Was it the states or was it the Prime Minister who failed to establish a system of safe national quarantine?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Again, Mr Speaker, I mean, the question from Labor is misrepresenting the statements of yesterday, Mr Speaker. I've made it very clear that the border measures that are put in place by the states relate to public health orders, and they are clearly responsibilities of the states when it comes to people moving from one state to another. So, Mr Speaker, I would ask that the Labor Party cease in misrepresenting that. But, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about quarantine, and the most important challenge for quarantine right now is to ensure that home quarantine trials are successful, so home quarantine becomes the norm, that enables Australians who are overseas to be able to return, that enables Australians who are here now and who have been vaccinated can go overseas, Mr Speaker, as they used to, and be able to return and quarantine at home. This is the very matter I was discussing only last night with the New South Wales Premier, because it's so important to enable international travel to start again, that home quarantine, Mr Speaker, is the answer to that. That is what is set out in the National Plan. That is what is agreed in the National Plan. That is what has been led by the Commonwealth, Mr Speaker, in moving us into a home quarantine phase that will enable Australians to travel again.
It will enable more people to be able to come into the country, be they students or be they skilled workers that are so necessary for Australia's economic performance, and that they, Mr Speaker, can take advantage of a range of different quarantine arrangements, both commercially provided and otherwise provided, that will enable the national plan to gear up and strengthen our economy into the future. So, Mr Speaker, home quarantine is what is needed. Home quarantine is what is going to release Australians out of the lockouts, Mr Speaker, out of the lockdowns, and to ensure that safely Australia can live with this virus. And I would urge all members of this chamber to support the move to go now to home quarantine that will see Australians be able to return home who are vaccinated, and vaccinated Australians being able to travel again, to be reunited with their families overseas, Mr Speaker. That is the challenge that's now before us. That's what's set out in the national plan that I took to the National Cabinet and was agreed, and I look forward to working closely, whether it is in South Australia, where the trial is already underway, where further trials will be done in New South Wales, and I encourage all other states, be it in Queensland or Western Australia, Tasmania, Mr Speaker, to get on board with those initiatives. I know they're watching those trials very closely, and they'll be very enthusiastic about taking it up, because the national plan enables Australians to live with the virus, and home quarantine enables Australians to live with the virus and connect again with each other and all around the world.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Australia-US Defence Alliance is creating a stronger partnership between our defence industries so that our ADF has the capability it needs to keep Australia safe and secure?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Sturt and just acknowledge and thank him for his passion and interest in South Australia's defence industry, especially that world-leading shipbuilding industry. Thank you so much. Mr Speaker, today we celebrate our long-standing and deep friendship with the United States, 70 years of the ANZUS Treaty, an unbreakable bond that has reached new heights, especially between our two defence industries. We have joined Lockheed Martin in the US, Mr Speaker, to deliver the most advanced war-fighting aircraft in the world, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. 50 Australian companies share in some $2.7 billion worth of work in this program, with Australian-made parts on every F-35 globally. Morand in Melbourne manufactures the vertical tails. Ferrer Engineering in Brisbane manufactures the weapons adapters, and CableX in Melbourne, well, they manufacture the cabling. Mr Speaker, I had the great pleasure of witnessing this partnership in action firsthand when I visited the F-35 production line in Dallas, Texas some 2 years ago. It really was indeed a very proud moment to see those very shiny, upright Morand vertical tails on every F-35 on the assembly line. Australian workers and also defence personnel train and work in the US with their American colleagues in the F-35 program, Mr Speaker, creating new skills to operate and to maintain these aircraft at home and also abroad. Mr Speaker, when I went to the US, I went with one goal in mind, and that was to win more F-35 work for Australian defence industry, and I'm very proud that we succeeded, Mr Speaker, with Western Sydney-based Quickstep winning more manufacturing work because of that visit. And only last year, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister and I announced the first military aircraft to be designed and built in Australia in more than 50 years has been rolled out in partnership with Boeing, and I'm talking about the Loyal Wingman, Mr Speaker. The development of this aircraft in Australia is Boeing's largest investment in unmanned aircraft outside of the United States, and we should be incredibly proud of that. This will ensure our two countries have a leading edge, Mr Speaker, in the field of autonomous warfighting capabilities. And a bit closer to home, here in Canberra, Mr Speaker, CEA has developed the world's most advanced radar systems for defence capabilities, and with exports to the US of that particular capability. Mr Speaker, the ANZUS has taken our alliance to excuse me, put my teeth back in, to new levels. This is creating a much stronger, not yet, a stronger bond between our two countries, Mr Speaker.
Well, I think it'll get a
And
run,
as the Minister for Defence Industry, I'm very focused on bringing us even closer together. No one can say with any certainty, Mr Speaker, what the future threats are to the security of this country. But what is clear is that a defence industry partnership with the US ensures that our men and women in uniform have what they need to keep us safe and secure.
And I call the member for Macon. Member for Macon might just start again and we'll start the clock again. Your microphone wasn't on at the beginning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday the Prime Minister said, ultimately everything is a state matter. Was it the states or was it the Prime Minister who said the vaccination program was not a race?
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's made very clear that the statement made as the preamble to that question is not accurate. It related to a response the Prime Minister gave when asked about the closure of state borders. It has been repeated since the Prime Minister has raised this, and Mr Speaker, it is very clear that this misleading statement, regardless of how often it's repeated, is factually not correct. Mr Speaker, it shouldn't be allowed.
Leader of the House, no, I can't agree with the Leader of the House. The practice has made very clear, and since 1901, it's not for the Speaker to vouch for the accuracy of statements, or of questions, or indeed answers, or indeed answers, which is if someone claims to have been misrepresented. We've got the standing orders so organised that there's an official capacity for them to do that at the end of question time or at the end of when a comment's been made. So the question is in order and the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would encourage the member to go and have a chat with Senator Kitching. Mr Speaker, I would encourage him next time they're in their caucus room, Mr Speaker, to go and have a chat with the ALP Senator for Victoria about the progress of the vaccination rollout, Mr Speaker, which she has made very clear is the reason Australia is moving away from lockdowns in this country, and I welcome her acknowledgement of that, Mr Speaker. Those here who sit opposite us may want to come in here every day, Mr Speaker, and seek to undermine that program. They may wish to engage in their usual politicisation of the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr Speaker. They may wish to choose that, but they reinforce only one thing to the Australian people, Mr Speaker, that they are only engaged in negativity. They are only engaged, Mr Speaker, in running down the country. Even here yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition—
just say to the Prime Minister that the question was asked by the member for Macon, and the Prime Minister needs to be relevant to the question that was asked by the member. It's not an opportunity to begin a political debate on yesterday or today or any other matter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What I can confirm is that, as the Minister for Health and Aged Care has done, is that today we are likely to go past the milestone of some 20 million doses of vaccines being administered around the country. 20 million, Mr Speaker. 20 million doses, and that means that some almost 60% of the eligible population, Mr Speaker, aged over 16, will have had, around 60% of them would have had their first dose in this country. And, Mr Speaker, that's around 35.7% who've had a second dose. And for those over 50, Mr Speaker, it is almost now 80% who have had their first dose and 52.9% who have had their second dose. And very importantly, Mr Speaker, 87.8% of those aged over 70, the most vulnerable in our community, have had their first dose, and 63.8%, Mr Speaker, have had their second dose. And I can update the House on my earlier response, as further information has been brought to me after my morning briefing this morning, that for aged care workers, Mr Speaker, first dose is now 82.9% and second dose is 61.3%, Mr Speaker. So, Mr Speaker, the vaccination program is a central part to the government's national plan to get Australia beyond these lockdowns which are doing such terrible damage to people in this country.
and that we need to get past these lockdowns, Mr Speaker. And the vaccination program is liberating Australians from those lockdowns, Mr Speaker, which is the objective of the national plan. Not to keep Australians shut in, Mr Speaker, not to keep Australians locked out of states around this country. Mr Speaker, the national plan is about opening up Australia. The national plan is about connecting Australians to other Australians and connecting Australia's economy to the world, Mr Speaker, so Australian businesses can continue to go forward and have confidence to invest and to employ.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is working closely in the ANZUS alliance to tackle the threats of serious organised crime and terrorism in order to create a stronger Australia and keep all Australians safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you, and I thank the member for his question and recognise his ongoing interest in national security matters and the great work that he is doing as a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. So on the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS Treaty, it's worth reflecting on the strength of our alliance and the great strides that we have made together in addressing a range of challenges, because it's a fact that COVID is not the only challenge to our safety and security. And it's a fact that serious and organised crime and terrorism are threats that don't recognise borders. That's why our government continues to build ties and work extremely closely with allied nations, particularly our ANZUS partners, who are also part of our Five Eyes intelligence network. I've had a number of meetings recently with the US Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas on a range of national security issues. And of course, our two nations will continue to work very closely and very effectively on a range of operational issues. Now, we've seen that just recently with the success of the AFP's Operation Ironside. Now, that operation was born out of the very close relationship between the FBI and the AFP. It's been a very long-standing relationship that has served Australia and the United States very well. Now, our international network was mobilised and we worked very collaboratively on the technology that enabled us to listen in on criminal networks and ultimately to be able to take them down. Now, this has made Australia a safer place by taking drugs and crime bosses off our streets. And so far, 293 offenders have been charged and close to 5,000 kilograms of drugs have been seized. And Australia, of course, is also a big beneficiary under an historic new data sharing agreement with the US that will give our local law enforcement agencies more tools with the fight on crime. So after we passed enabling legislation in June of this year, we are now looking to settle and finalise the terms of that agreement and to do that before the end of this year. Now, when it comes to national security and when it comes to the safety of our community, Australians know that this government, the coalition government, is a government that they can rely on to keep them safe and secure. And we're absolutely getting on with the job of making sure that we are looking after the best interests of Australians, and we are taking every action that we possibly can to ensure that they are safe and secure at home and in their communities.
The member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday the Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Is it the states or is it the Prime Minister who is responsible for vaccinating children aged 12 to 15? When will they be vaccinated?
The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you,
has
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. It is indeed the federal government's responsibility to run the national vaccination program. Mr Speaker, I've made that point very clearly from whether it be this dispatch box or any other place which we've been speaking from, and we've made that very clear. And indeed, when we receive the final advice, the member would be, because I know he does follow these things earnestly, when we received the final advice from ATAGI last Friday, we made the immediate decision to proceed with the vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds, and bookings will be available from the 13th of this month.
and that will follow the expansion of the problem into expansion of the program to 16 to 29-year-olds from earlier this week. And, Mr Speaker, we did that, knowing full well that we'd be able to give greater support to that vaccination program for 12 to 15-year-olds because of what we knew was in the works in terms of accessing additional supplies, Pfizer supplies, particularly out of Singapore, Mr Speaker. And we were able to announce those decisions,
Member for
Mr
MacArthur
Speaker,
has
this
asked
week,
this question.
which shows an additional 500,000 doses that we're able to bring forward and ensure that that can support the vaccination of children aged 12 to 15. Now, Mr Speaker, we will report those figures of vaccinations of those 12 to 15, as we have reported all other figures throughout the course of the pandemic and been very transparent about them, because I know that parents, as a parent of 2 children aged between 12 and 15, Mr Speaker, the parents will be very interested to know about how we're progressing with those vaccinations for that age group. It's an important group to be vaccinated. That's why we moved immediately to ensure that they, more broadly, would be able to be vaccinated. We'd already taken the decision some weeks ago, Mr Speaker, for those in Indigenous communities and remote places, with those with other health conditions, to be vaccinated prior to that. And that program has already been running now for many weeks, as the member is, I'm sure, aware. And I want to thank, as the member himself, a local health professional in his own community over many years, greatly respected, Mr Speaker, knows the tremendous job that general practitioners are doing supporting that vaccination program. And, Mr Speaker, when you're talking about young children, as I'm sure the member knows, I'm sure he's given many injections to young children, the opportunity for them to go and sit there with the local GP who's helped them with every other sneeze and sniffle or even more serious things over time, and to be able to see a face they know, to be able to get that injection and to have that assurance from that health professional is extremely important. And I want to thank the GPs as they go about that job of vaccinating our children. That's an important trust we give to our GPs and nurses and everyone else who's doing it. And so I thank you for doing it, and I thank you for the way that you will engage in that. I'm pleased that we've been able to get the additional doses to support that, and there are more irons in the fire as well for that outcome as well, Mr Speaker.
The member for Mackellar. Member for Mackellar. The member for Boothby.
There is a technical issue. Am I able to ask the question on behalf of the member for Mackellar?
Yeah, this is questions without notice. Anyone
okay,
can
great.
ask a question.
Let's go. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the Minister please update the House on why sticking to the national plan is vital for Australian small and family businesses, especially in light of today's national accounts and especially for those residents of the member for Mackellar's electorate?
The Minister for Employment.
Let me thank the member for Boothby. I was expecting the member for Grey to ask the question. Today's national accounts, of course, have got a pleasing number at 0.7% growth for the June quarter. But importantly for small business, and whilst the results are better than many expected, small business is still doing it tough. And unpacking the numbers today, we see one of the biggest contributors to the 0.7% growth in the quarter is household consumption, driven by expenditure on services, and many of the providers of those services are our small and family businesses. Services like cafes, restaurants, hotels and transport services and the like. Now, this demonstrates the fundamentals of the economy under the stewardship of the Morrison government are strong, and they bounce back strongly once restrictions are lifted. It also shows that Australian households are doing their bit by supporting our small to medium enterprises through local consumption, and it's important that we continue to do our bit as well, Mr Speaker. Now, it's clear that the supports the Morrison government has put in place during the pandemic are working, and they're working well. But it is fundamental we continue to stick to the agreed national plan if we're going to follow this through. The national plan's our national hope. It's the national hope for small and family businesses right across Australia. If we stick to the national plan, our small and family businesses, our families operating them, can actually plan with certainty. If we move away from our national plan, we will take national hope away from them. Our small businesses have been fundamentally impacted by COVID-19. We all know that. It's why the Morrison government has put in place the largest package of financial supports in our nation's history, $291 billion worth. Everything from JobKeeper to business support payments, the SME Recovery Loan Scheme, all there to assist small and medium enterprises. They buy us time, but they aren't a permanent solution for our small business community. As the Prime Minister has said, as we fight our way towards 70% and 80% vaccination rates, as per the agreed national plan, we can open up Australia, and that means our small and family businesses can open up. The national plan gives us certainty. The CEO of COSBOA made this very well, Alexi Boyd, saying small businesses need to be able to plan. She welcomed the national plan. Her words were, "It's great, we've now got this. It's imperative that all states work together to support the reopening as fast as we can." The Morrison government is on a unity ticket. We're all on a unity ticket over here with small businesses on the national plan. It's now important that everyone else and every other parliament joins that unity ticket with us.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and in adding to the first answer to the first question from the government side today, Mr Speaker, I table an open letter from the business community representing some 80 different organisations encompassing Australia's largest businesses, in particular, Mr Speaker, asking for governments to work together to implement the national plan and chart a path out of the current lockdowns, and I table that letter, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the House, we'll just do papers first and then I'll...
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Our documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
Thank the Leader of the House. The Leader of the Opposition had indicated he wished to have the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to give a personal explanation.
Does the Leader of the Opposition claim to have been misrepresented?
I do, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition may proceed.
Again today, the Prime Minister repeated his statement in relation to COVID that I was, quote, hoping for the worst. This is wrong and offensive. The worst outcome from COVID is the loss of life, which tragically over 1,000 families in Australia have felt. The suggestion by the Prime Minister says a lot about his character and undermines the dignity of the House, and it should not be repeated in this House.
Hear, hear.
We'll now move to the matter of public importance. I've received a letter from the Honourable Member for Whitlam proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the failure of the government to manage the economy in the interest of working people and small business. I call upon those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places, and I call the Honourable Member for Whitlam.